Welcome to the lecture. Chapter 28, The Triumph of Conservatism. Chapter 28, Government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem. Ronald Reagan says that line at his 1981 inauguration, and it becomes more or less the operating philosophy of American politics for the next 4 decades. Argued over, reapplied, and reopened every single time Congress debates something like student debt relief or expanding health coverage. Ask yourself honestly, next time you see one of those arguments online, how much of it is actually a fresh debate, and how much of it is just Reagan's sentence rerun? This chapter covers 12 years, 1980 to 1992, and 3 through lines run underneath everything in it. 1. The rise of market-first economics, tax cuts, deregulation, and a genuine remaking of who the American economy actually serves. 2. The new right's social agenda finally getting real institutional teeth on abortion, on the AIDS crisis, on Central America. And 3, the actual end of the Cold War and the birth of an American-led New World Order that in hindsight turned out to be a lot less orderly than the phrase promised. We're covering 6 things today. 1. Reaganomics and what it actually did to American inequality. 2. The new right's social agenda and the AIDS crisis it collided with. 3. The secret wars in Central America, Iran-Contra, and the church-based sanctuary movement that grew up in direct opposition to them. 4. The nuclear freeze movement and the surprising, genuinely collaborative way the Cold War actually ended. 5. George H.W. Bush, the Gulf War, and the template it set for every American Middle East intervention that followed. And 6. Anita Hill's testimony and what it started that the country wouldn't fully reckon with for another 25 years. Let's get into it. Part 1. Reaganomics and the remaking of the economy. Reagan comes into office in 1980 with a genuinely coherent theory, not just a vibe. He'd spent decades transforming from a New Deal Democrat into California's conservative governor, and his economic strategy, Reaganomics, rests on supply-side theory. Cut taxes, especially on top earners and corporations, deregulate industry, and the resulting investment and growth will supposedly trickle down to everyone else, reducing the need for government social programs in the process. Congress passes his tax cut in 1981, a 30% reduction phased in over 3 years, alongside more than $40 billion in domestic spending cuts. The immediate results are rough. Unemployment actually climbs to nearly 10% by 1983 before the economy turns around. Inflation finally drops from 14% to 4%, and by 1984, growth is healthy again. But look at where the savings actually went. Reagan cuts food stamps, school lunch funding, welfare, and Medicaid, while protecting the middle-class programs, Medicare and Social Security, that vote in larger numbers. The money saved doesn't shrink government. It gets redirected into a massive military buildup, funneling contracts and tax breaks toward large defense corporations instead. The results show up starkly in the numbers. The number of American millionaires doubles during the decade. By its end, the top 1% of families control 42% of the nation's wealth and 60% of corporate stock. Meanwhile, the poverty rate climbs from under 12% to over 13.5%, representing 33 million Americans. The homeless population grows to as many as 400,000 people, and the middle class itself shrinks from 53% of families down to 49%. Television gives the decade its own soundtrack of excess. Shows like Dallas and Dynasty glamorizing oil baron wealth, and the film Wall Street handing the era its unofficial motto: greed, for lack of a better word, is good. Reagan also takes direct aim at organized labor. In 1981, when air traffic controllers strike for better pay and safety conditions, Reagan fires every striker who refuses to return to work and permanently replaces them. That move effectively signals to every employer in the country that the federal government would no longer defend a strike, even a well-justified one. Union membership craters to 16% by decade's end, its lowest point since before the New Deal. And without that union leverage, wages simply stop keeping pace with inflation for millions of workers, a gap that never really closes back up. None of this stayed a 1980s story. The share of national income going to the top 0.1% of earners more than doubles during this decade and never really comes back down, which is the actual statistical starting point for basically every modern conversation about wealth inequality, billionaire political spending, and stagnant wages you'll see argued about today. Historians increasingly describe the Reagan-Thatcher turn, since British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher pursued nearly identical policies at the same time, as the birth of a genuinely global economic order, neoliberalism. Low taxes, deregulation, privatization, and a hollowed-out welfare state, producing exactly the dual economy of affluent professionals and precarious gig and service workers your generation actually lives inside. This isn't ancient economic history, it's the operating system. Part 2, the New Right Social Agenda and the AIDS Crisis. Reagan's economic agenda came bundled with the New Right Social one, and he delivers on plenty of it, though not all. His administration pushes to remove evolution and sex education from classrooms, restore school prayer, and restrict reproductive rights, requiring federally funded family planning clinics to notify parents before dispensing birth control to minors, and cutting off funding to any international organization that so much as counsels on abortion. The Supreme Court, despite Reagan's conservative appointments, refuses to overturn Roe v. Wade during his presidency. But the Equal Rights Amendment does die on his watch, failing to reach the 2/3 of states required before its 1982 ratification deadline expires, killed largely by the organizing campaign you already know from last chapter, Phyllis Schlafly's Stop ERA movement. Then a health crisis collides directly with this exact social agenda, and the collision is genuinely brutal. In the early 1980s, physicians trace a mysterious, deadly illness striking gay men to a virus that destroys the immune system, HIV, leading to acquired immune deficiency syndrome, AIDS. The Reagan administration's response is, for years, functionally silence. Reagan himself doesn't publicly say the word AIDS until 1985, 4 years and thousands of deaths into the epidemic. A delay public health historians still treat as a genuine moral failure, not just political caution, one shaped directly by the New Right's discomfort even acknowledging gay Americans existed as a constituency worth protecting. Into that vacuum of government indifference steps ACT UP, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, founded in 1987. ACT UP pioneers a genuinely new template for health activism. Die-ins staged in public spaces, blockades of Wall Street to protest the price of the only approved AIDS drug, and a 1988 action where protesters physically shut down the FDA's headquarters, demanding faster drug approval and government accountability. It's confrontational, media-savvy, unapologetic, and it works, directly speeding up the FDA's approval process for experimental treatments in ways that would go on to help other disease communities entirely unrelated to HIV. That template didn't disappear once effective HIV treatment finally arrived in the mid-1990s. The exact organizing playbook ACT UP built, direct confrontation, visible bodies in public space, targeting a specific government agency's indifference, is the direct ancestor of modern queer and trans health activism. Current organizing around PrEP access, gender-affirming care, and public health funding for other underserved diseases all draw explicitly and often literally on ACT UP's tactics and specific alumni. A movement born out of the New Right's willful silence in the 1980s is still the operating manual for health activism decades after the immediate crisis that produced it. Part 3. Central America, Iran-Contra, and the Sanctuary Movement. Reagan's anti-communism runs hottest in America's own backyard. When Nicaraguan revolutionaries called the Sandinistas overthrow a brutal dictatorship in 1979, Reagan becomes convinced Moscow is secretly behind it, and in 1982 authorizes the CIA to train and fund a counter-revolutionary force, the Contras, who Reagan publicly calls the moral equivalent of our founding fathers. Despite a documented record of the group burning villages, blowing up infrastructure, and killing civilians. Congress, uneasy, passes the Boland Amendment, banning direct aid to the Contras. The administration finds a workaround anyway, secretly selling weapons to Iran in violation of an arms embargo, and funneling the profits straight to the Contras, entirely bypassing Congress. When the story breaks in 1986, it becomes the Iran-Contra scandal. Congressional hearings expose the operation in detail, and 11 administration officials are eventually convicted. Though Reagan himself, criticized as a detached, poorly managing executive, weathers the political fallout without facing removal from office. Nicaragua wasn't the only front. In El Salvador, the U.S. sends over $5 billion in military trainers to prop up a government whose allied death squads kill an estimated 40,000 civilians throughout the decade. And Reagan insists, against most evidence, that Cuba and Nicaragua were the real force behind El Salvador's insurgency, rather than homegrown grievances. In 1983, Reagan also invades the tiny Caribbean island of Grenada after a coup, ostensibly to protect American medical students there, a quick, popular military win that boosts his approval ratings at home, regardless of the actual strategic stakes involved. These wars produce refugees, and those refugees produce a genuine grassroots resistance movement inside the United States itself. Salvadorans and Guatemalans fleeing exactly the violence American policy was fueling apply for asylum by the tens of thousands. But because the U.S. government officially supported the regimes they were fleeing, it refuses to recognize most of them as legitimate refugees, choosing instead to treat them as economic migrants subject to deportation. In direct response, churches across the country declare themselves sanctuaries, openly and illegally sheltering Central American refugees from federal immigration enforcement. By the mid-1980s, 500 to 600 congregations had joined the sanctuary movement, and cities including Berkeley and San Francisco formally adopt City of Refuge policies, offering municipal protection on top of the church's religious one. That's not a historical curiosity. It's the direct, literal ancestor of every modern sanctuary city ordinance and every congregation currently sheltering a family facing deportation right now. The exact same legal and moral argument that federal immigration enforcement shouldn't override a local community's decision to protect people fleeing danger the government itself helped create, just running under a different acronym in a different decade. A powerful legacy of grassroots sanctuary organizing and local community protection. Congress does eventually pass a broader immigration fix in 1986, the Immigration Reform and Control Act, combining employer sanctions for hiring undocumented workers with a one-time amnesty for roughly 3 million undocumented immigrants who could prove continuous U.S. residents since before 1982. That single law is the reason today's immigration system contains both a large population of long legalized former undocumented residents and, simultaneously, a renewed undocumented workforce that arrived after the amnesty's cutoff. The exact demographic split still driving arguments over DACA and comprehensive immigration reform to this day. Part 4. The Nuclear Freeze and the Cold War's End. Reagan enters office as a genuine Cold War hardliner, calling the Soviet Union an evil empire and dramatically accelerating the arms race. That escalation, planning to station new nuclear missiles across Western Europe, triggers a massive grassroots backlash. In 1981, women peace activists set up a permanent protest encampment at Greenham Common in England, outside a base slated to house incoming missiles, one of 20 such camps across the country, organizing through songs, sit-ins, and sustained nonviolent presence. A parallel nuclear freeze movement explodes across the United States. In 1982, 750,000 people rally in New York's Central Park, demanding a mutual U.S.-Soviet freeze on producing and deploying nuclear weapons. Freeze referenda passed by wide margins on local ballots nationwide, and by 1982, polling shows 57% of Americans supporting an immediate freeze outright. Even the Catholic bishops weigh in, issuing a formal 1983 pastoral letter questioning the moral legitimacy of nuclear deterrence itself. This wasn't fringe activism getting ignored. Reagan himself later acknowledges the pressure mattered, that watching European leaders squeezed by their own country's protest movements genuinely shifted his calculations. And then Soviet politics hands the moment an unexpected partner. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev becomes the Soviet Union's leader and launches glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring. Genuine attempts to loosen state control and modernize a collapsing economy. Reforms that depend entirely on actually reducing Cold War tension rather than continuing to fund an arms race the Soviet economy could no longer afford. Reagan and Gorbachev meet repeatedly between 1985 and 1988, agree at a 1986 summit to cut strategic nuclear arsenals in half, and signed the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty in 1987, the first agreement to actually eliminate an entire category of nuclear weapons rather than just cap their growth. By 1988, Reagan is standing at Lenin's tomb in Moscow, telling reporters the evil empire framing simply no longer applied. Gorbachev's reforms spiral outward fast. In 1989, he announces the Soviet Union will no longer forcibly enforce communist rule across Eastern Europe, and one government after another falls, mostly peacefully. Poland's Solidarity movement, led by dockworker Lech Walesa, wins free elections. The Berlin Wall comes down in November 1989. By 1991, the Soviet Union itself dissolves entirely. It's genuinely one of the most consequential and, remarkably, least violent geopolitical transformations of the entire 20th century, driven by a combination of top-down reform, grassroots pressure on both sides of the Iron Curtain, and, frankly, a fair amount of contingency and luck. The nuclear freeze movement's basic argument, that existential risk is a political choice citizens can organize against rather than simply an inevitability to accept, is exactly the same argument running underneath today's climate justice organizing. And it's the same instinct resurfacing directly whenever nuclear rhetoric spikes around Russia's ongoing war in Ukraine. Grassroots pressure genuinely helped make serious arms control diplomacy possible in the 1980s. Whether it can do the same for nuclear risk or climate risk today is, honestly, still an open question. But the template these activists built for how ordinary people can move that specific needle hasn't gone anywhere. Part 5. Bush and the Gulf War. George H.W. Bush inherits both the tail end of Reagan's conservative legacy and a genuinely reshaped world, calling for a kinder, gentler nation while largely continuing his predecessor's economic and judicial approach. His presidency's defining moment comes in August 1990, when Iraq's Saddam Hussein invades and annexes neighboring Kuwait. Bush assembles something genuinely unusual, an actual international coalition, 38 nations including Arab states like Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Syria, backed by a United Nations resolution demanding Iraqi withdrawal, 700,000 troops deployed to the region in preparation. When Hussein ignores the deadline, Operation Desert Storm launches in January 1991. Weeks of air bombardment followed by a ground invasion that liberates Kuwait in just 100 hours. Iraqi forces, worn down from a decade-long war with Iran, collapse almost immediately. An estimated 100,000 Iraqis die. The coalition loses a comparatively tiny 136. That restraint and that specific formula, a clearly defined, limited objective, genuine international coalition building, UN legitimacy, overwhelming force applied briefly rather than an open-ended occupation, becomes the explicit template American policymakers reach for in every subsequent Middle East debate. It's the model NATO leans on for intervention in Kosovo later in the decade. And it's the model the second Bush administration explicitly claims to be following, and just as explicitly abandons when it invades Iraq again in 2003, this time without the UN's blessing, without anywhere near the same coalition, and without any real exit plan. A war that drags on for years, specifically because it ignored nearly every lesson the 1991 war was supposed to have taught. The permanent American military presence across the Middle East and the post-9/11 counterterrorism framework your entire generation grew up inside of both trace their institutional roots directly back to the coalition infrastructure and basing arrangements Bush builds during this exact 1990 to 91 buildup. Beyond Iraq, Bush governs at the actual hinge point of the Cold War's end. He watches the Soviet Union formally dissolve in 1991 and negotiates further arms reductions with Gorbachev's successor, Boris Yeltsin. Communist regimes fall across Eastern Europe largely peacefully. Apartheid collapses in South Africa with Nelson Mandela's release after 27 years in prison, and Chile's dictator Pinochet finally cedes power to an elected government. It's a genuine wave of democratization sweeping much of the globe at once, and for a brief moment in the early 1990s, it looked to plenty of serious people like history itself might simply be arriving at a stable, liberal democratic conclusion. Part 6. Anita Hill and the Supreme Court. Bush's biggest domestic controversy has nothing to do with Iraq. In 1991, he nominates Clarence Thomas, a conservative black judge who opposes affirmative action, to replace the retiring Thurgood Marshall, the court's first black justice, on the Supreme Court. During Thomas's confirmation hearings, Anita Hill, a law professor who had worked for Thomas at the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, testifies before the all-male Senate Judiciary Committee and a nationally televised audience that Thomas had repeatedly sexually harassed her years earlier. The hearing becomes a genuine cultural spectacle, a black woman publicly naming a powerful black man's misconduct in front of a Senate committee that, notably, includes 0 women. Thomas denies everything, calls the proceedings a high-tech lynching, and the Senate confirms him anyway, narrowly, 52 to 48. Hill loses that specific vote. But her testimony doesn't just disappear. In the year immediately following her hearing, sexual harassment complaints filed with the EEOC nearly double, and they keep climbing steadily through the rest of the decade. Direct evidence that millions of women watching recognize their own workplace experiences in what Hill described and, for the first time in large numbers, felt some institutional permission to actually report it. Women's political fundraising organizations, groups like Emily's List, see a genuine surge in support. 1992 gets nicknamed the Year of the Woman in American politics. A record number of women win seats in Congress that November, running, many of them explicitly, on the anger Hill's treatment had generated. Historians increasingly read the Hill hearing as a direct precursor to the #MeToo movement roughly 25 years later, a specific, named case of workplace sexual harassment told publicly by the woman who experienced it, forcing law, media, and popular culture to actually reckon with an issue institutions had spent decades quietly ignoring. Even though, in both cases, the powerful man at the center of the accusation ultimately faced no lasting professional consequence. The mechanism repeats almost exactly. A credible public accusation moving the culture even when it doesn't move the specific outcome. Bush's Gulf War approval numbers never translate into re-election. A recession, rising deficits, and a genuine sense that Bush was disconnected from ordinary Americans' economic anxiety opened the door for Arkansas Governor Bill Clinton, while Texas businessman Ross Perot's independent campaign, built almost entirely around alarm over the federal deficit, siphons off 19% of the popular vote, mostly from Bush. Clinton wins by a wide electoral margin, and the 12-year Reagan-Bush conservative era, tax cuts, deregulation, the new right's social agenda, a newly triumphant American foreign policy, comes to a close though, as you'll see in the chapters ahead. Its actual policy architecture proves a great deal more durable than the single election that interrupted it. Pull it together. Go back to Reagan's line, "Government is the problem." This chapter shows you exactly what happens when a governing philosophy actually gets to run for 12 straight years. An economy that produced real growth alongside genuinely brutal inequality. A social agenda that scored real wins, killing the ERA, while colliding disastrously with a public health crisis it refused to even name for years. And a foreign policy that ended one global conflict, the Cold War, through a genuinely remarkable combination of grassroots pressure and elite diplomacy, while opening up an entirely new and much messier set of conflicts across the Middle East that the country is, frankly, still fighting the consequences of. Almost nothing in this chapter stayed contained to these 12 years. Reaganomics is the direct starting point for the wealth inequality debates and billionaire political spending arguments running through headlines right now. The sanctuary movement is the direct ancestor of every sanctuary city ordinance defended or attacked today. IRCA's amnesty plus enforcement structure is the exact framework DACA fights still operate inside. ACT UP's confrontational template still runs modern queer and trans health organizing. The nuclear freeze movement's core argument, that existential risk is a choice, not a fate, is the same argument climate activists make today. The Gulf War's coalition-building template got explicitly invoked and explicitly ignored in 2003. And Anita Hill's testimony is the reason #MeToo had a legal and cultural framework already sitting there waiting to be used 25 years later. This period doesn't feel like a discrete Reagan chapter once you actually look closely. It's the origin story sitting directly underneath a huge amount of what you argue about in your own newsfeed, your own campus, and quite possibly your own family's history. Get your Chapter 28 source response done in Canvas, and next time, we watch what happens when the Cold War's certainties disappear and a new set of arguments about globalization, terrorism, and American identity take their place. See you in Chapter 29.